The front door was the problem. Not its lock, which Christy Ferry had checked twice before the school run that morning the way she checked everything twice: the stove, the windows, the latch on the garden gate that faced the alley behind Sycamore Close. The lock was fine. The problem with the front door was what was on the other side of it when she returned at 12:47 on a Thursday afternoon in February, with Ariella on her hip and 2 bags of groceries cutting into her left forearm, and the specific, measured calm of a woman who had learned to manage the particular category of complicated that came with the particular category of household she worked in. There were 4 men on the doorstep. Not the postman. Not the window cleaner who came on the second Friday of each month. Not any version of the ordinary world that Sycamore Close presented to itself and its residents in the careful, manicured language of a street that had decided its business was nobody else's business. The front passenger door opened first. A man got out who Christy had never seen and who she immediately, instinctively, understood was not the same category of person as the 4 on the doorstep, not in terms of function, which was related, but in terms of the specific gravity he brought to the act of simply standing on a pavement and looking at a front door. Then the rear door opened. The man who came out of the rear door of the black car was tall. Not dramatically tall, tall in the way of someone whose height was the least significant physical fact about them, the way the height of a building is the least significant fact about what happens inside it. He was wearing a dark overcoat over a gray suit, and he moved toward the front door of the house on Sycamore Close with the unhurried, absolute certainty of a man who had long ago stopped adjusting his pace to accommodate the expectations of the spaces he moved through. He took in the front doorstep in one sweep. The 4 men. Christy. The groceries. The child on Christy's hip. And then Ariella, who was 3 years old and had the specific, unwavering perception of a child who lived at a frequency that most adults had organized themselves out of, looked at the man coming toward the door and said, in the clear, carrying voice of a child making an identification she was completely certain about, "Daddy." The 4 men on the doorstep went still. Not the stillness of shock, though shock was in there. The stillness of men who have encountered a variable that has reorganized the entire calculation, who are looking at the man walking toward them and looking at the child on the maid's hip pointing at him and running the math and arriving, with the specific, cold clarity of professional instinct, at a conclusion that made the doorstep a very different place than it had been 30 seconds ago. The man with the overcoat stopped walking. He looked at Ariella. Something happened to his face that had nothing to do with the doorstep or the 4 men or the debt or the February afternoon or anything in the world except a 3-year-old child who had just said a word that he had not heard directed at him, had not known he needed to hear directed at him, and that landed in his chest with the specific, irreversible force of a thing that cannot be unfelt once it has been felt. His name was Justin Tyler. And nothing about Thursday afternoon was going to survive what just happened. A note before we begin. This narrator came to this story through the people who lived it, through Christy Ferry, who tells it with the particular precision of someone who was the only adult in the room who kept her head when everything else lost theirs, and through what Justin Tyler himself has confirmed in the months since. What follows is assembled from those accounts. The doorstep happened exactly as described. What came after it is the part that required 8 chapters to contain. Subscribe right now. Because what Justin Tyler does in the next 4 minutes after Ariella says that word, before he says a single thing to the 4 men on the doorstep, is not what anyone standing on that pavement predicted. And you need to be here when it happens. To understand the doorstep, you have to understand the house. And to understand the house, you have to understand the 2 women inside it, or rather, the woman who owned it and the woman who kept it, because those were 2 entirely different things, and the difference between them is where the story actually lives. Laura Hubbard had moved to Sycamore Close 14 months ago. The move had been organized by a solicitor named Gideon Vare, who handled what remained of her affairs with the careful, slightly exhausted efficiency of a man managing a situation that had exceeded its original specifications. The house was a 3-bedroom end terrace on a quiet street in the kind of neighborhood that had been, 10 years ago, ordinary and had since been discovered by the kind of money that finds ordinary things and converts them into statements. It was not the house Laura had lived in before. It was not the postcode, the square footage, or the quality of the light through the kitchen windows in the morning. It was, however, what was available in the specific, compressed circumstances of a woman who had exited a marriage with considerably less than she had entered it and was trying to build something functional from what remained. The debts were not entirely her own making. This is a fact that the story requires to be stated clearly before the accounting begins, because debt stories are usually told as moral failures, and Laura Hubbard's situation was considerably more architectural than moral. She had married into a financial structure that was, at its legitimate surface, a commercial property portfolio, and at its less legitimate depth, something that moved through the legitimate surface the way water moves through soil, invisibly, pervasively, in ways that changed the composition of everything it touched without being detectable from above. She had not designed the structure. She had lived inside it for 5 years and had not, until the marriage began its dissolution, understood the degree to which living inside a structure and being responsible for it could become, in the right legal framing, the same thing. The debts that arrived on Sycamore Close had been accumulating for 2 years. They were of 2 kinds. The first kind was legitimate credit extended against assets that had depreciated faster than anyone had projected in the specific, cascading way of financial structures that have hidden dependencies and that reveal those dependencies only when a component fails. The second kind was less legitimate, which was the kind that does not send invoices, but sends men to doorsteps in February. Laura had been managing both kinds with the focused, grinding patience of a woman who understood that the alternative to management was a kind of collapse that she could not afford, literally and otherwise, because of the 3-year-old who lived in the house on Sycamore Close and who required, at minimum, the stability of a roof, and a woman named Christy Ferry who arrived at 8 every morning and left at 6 every evening and was, in the specific accounting of that household, the most reliable thing in it. Christy Ferry had been with Laura for 8 months. She had come through a domestic placement agency that specialized in what their literature called transitional household support, the specific, delicate category of service that is needed when a household has moved from one configuration to another and the person at its center is managing too many things to manage the domestic dimension alone. Christy was 33. She had been doing household work in various capacities since she was 22, and she had worked for 6 employers before Laura, and the range of those 6 employers had given her a specific, comprehensive education in the varieties of household crisis that money does not prevent and sometimes, in its particular way, guarantees. She had worked for a surgeon whose marriage was ending in the specific, quiet violence of a legal process. She had worked for a financier whose confidence in his own management of his circumstances had been, she had observed from the inside, the primary obstacle to the actual management of those circumstances. She had worked for a widow, and for a widower, and for a young family whose chaos was the joyful kind, which was her favorite kind. Laura was none of those things exactly. Laura was a woman in the specific, difficult terrain between what she had been and what she was becoming, and the primary resident of the house on Sycamore Close who was not in that terrain, who was simply and completely present in the way that 3-year-olds are present, without reference to the past or the future, in the full and consuming now, was Uriella. Uriella, who had dark eyes and her father's coloring and the specific, absolute confidence of a child who has been loved consistently enough to have never considered the possibility that she wouldn't be. Uriella, who had not seen her father in 14 months. Uriella, who was 3 years old and had learned his face from a photograph that sat on the second shelf of the bookcase in the living room, a photograph that Laura had not removed because she had not been able to remove it, which was a separate, complicated truth that the story will reach in its own time. Uriella, who looked at the man coming toward the doorstep on a Thursday afternoon in February and said "Daddy" with the complete, unself-conscious certainty of a child who has been looking at a face for a long time and has finally found it standing in front of her. And Justin Tyler, who had not known his daughter's address, who had not known, when the men who owed him a substantial sum of money had offered, as partial settlement, the management of a debt recovery on their behalf, that the address on the file was Sycamore Close. Who had not known, until Uriella said that word, that the debt he had come to collect had a face he recognized. This is where the story begins. Justin Tyler had been in the business of financial recovery for long enough that the phrase financial recovery had become the way he described it even to himself, which was the most honest measure of how completely a person can normalize the vocabulary of their own life. He was 41. He had been born in Leeds to a family that had its own particular history with money, the kind of history where money was the primary organizing principle, but its absence was more formative than its presence, where the earliest lessons about the world were delivered in the specific pedagogy of not having enough and being surrounded by people who did. He had left Leeds at 19 with the specific, particular anger of a young man who has decided that the circumstances of his origin are not the ceiling of his trajectory. And he had spent the subsequent 2 decades building a career in the overlapping territories of legitimate commerce and its adjacencies. And what he had built was substantial and complicated and not entirely something he was proud of and entirely something he could not currently see a way out of. The legitimate portion was considerable. Commercial property, 3 warehousing facilities in the Midlands, a logistics operation that moved goods through the north in a network of routes that were efficient and documented and entirely above board. The less legitimate portion was the financial recovery, the recovery of money that had been lent outside the formal lending structures, by people who operated outside the formal lending structures, and which required, when the repayment schedules were not honored, a particular category of intervention that the formal structures were not equipped to provide. He did not use violence. This is the first clarification he offered to anyone who had the specific frame for him that certain people had, and it was accurate. He used presence, precision, and the specific, suffocating quality of sustained attention from people who communicated, through nothing more than their consistent arrival at the correct addresses at the correct times, that the situation was not going to resolve itself through waiting. The men who owed him the substantial sum were named Doyle and Pembridge. They were property developers of the specific, optimistic variety that appears in every rising market and disappears in the same market's correction, men who had borrowed aggressively against projections that the market had declined to fulfill, and who had extended their borrowing in every direction available to them, including directions that were outside the formal structures, which was where Justin Tyler's money had entered the picture. The meeting with Doyle and Pembridge had been, by the standards of these meetings, unusually productive. Most such meetings produced promises. This one produced a file. Doyle, who was the more pragmatic of the two, and who had calculated that partial satisfaction of a creditor was preferable to the alternative, offered the file as part of a restructured repayment arrangement. The file contained documentation of a debt owed to Doyle and Pembridge by a third party, a personal loan, collateralized against a property in the debtor's name, with a repayment schedule that had ceased to be honored 6 months prior. The amount was not trivial. The documentation was clean. And the address in the file was in a neighborhood Justin knew, not well, but enough to have a geography for it. A quiet street. Respectable. The kind of street that didn't expect visitors of the particular variety he was now being asked to deploy. He took the file. He reviewed it that evening in the office of the logistics company on the edge of the Midlands, with the focused, clinical attention he brought to any financial document. He noted the name of the debtor, Laura Hubbard, and registered it with the specific, arrested quality of a man who has encountered a familiar word in an unexpected context, and then moved his eyes to the address, and then sat in his chair in the office of the logistics company for a long time without moving. Laura Hubbard, who had been Laura Tyler for 5 years, whose solicitor Gideon Vare had spent the dissolution process specifically and deliberately preventing Justin from knowing her address, which Justin had accepted because the dissolution had been conducted in the specific, damaged manner of a separation between two people who had both made mistakes they could not fully account for to each other, and who had agreed, through their respective legal representatives, to a version of distance that was structured and final. Laura Hubbard, who had Ariella. He had not seen Ariella in 14 months. Not because he did not have legal access. The custody arrangement, such as it was complicated by the geography of the separation and by the specific, exhausting legal procedures that Gideon Vare had applied with methodical thoroughness to every communication that passed between the former spouses. He had sent gifts. He had sent money, outside the formal arrangement, directly, in the amounts he thought necessary, and then in higher amounts when it became clear that the formal arrangement was not providing what he thought it was providing. Because the gifts were returned and the money was accepted, and the silence between them was the particular, loaded silence of two people who have agreed on distance, but not on what the distance means. He had not known her address. He had tried, once, through a contact who had contacts, and Gideon Vare had somehow known within the week and had sent a letter in the specific, compressed legal vocabulary of a man communicating a warning while maintaining plausible deniability about the warning's nature. And now the address was in a file on his desk, in Doyle and Pembridge's handwriting, on a debt recovery document that he had accepted as partial payment. He called Rennick, who was his primary operational manager, and told him to put together a team for Thursday. He did not tell Rennick whose address it was. He was not certain until Thursday at 12:47 on Sycamore Close what he was going to do with the information. He was even less certain, approximately 90 seconds after arriving at 12:47, than he had been before he arrived. 90 seconds after arriving, a 3-year-old girl with his coloring and Laura's eyes looked at him from a stranger's hip and said the word he had been hearing in the specific, unguarded register of things a person allows themselves to want but does not permit themselves to expect. Christy Ferry had worked for Laura Hubbard for 8 months and had developed, over those 8 months, the specific, nuanced understanding of a household that comes from being its primary daily manager. An understanding that was more architectural than personal, more structural than intimate, but that contained within it a complete picture of what the house was and what it required to keep functioning. The house on Sycamore Close functioned on a schedule that Christy had established in the first 3 weeks and that Laura had adopted with the relieved gratitude of a woman who had been managing without a schedule for long enough that the arrival of one felt like being handed a life jacket. Ariella was up at 7. Breakfast was at 7:15, which was the window before the morning's specific chaos, the toddler's variable mood, the school run for the neighbor's child that Christy sometimes covered as a returned favor. The morning phone calls that Laura took in the bedroom with the door closed in the specific, compressed voice she used for conversations she didn't want Ariella to absorb. Christy knew the phone calls were financial. Not because Laura had told her. Laura did not discuss her finances with Christy, which was one of the conventions of their relationship, the professional boundary that preserved Laura's sense of control over a situation that was not fully in her control. Christy knew because she had been in 6 households, and she recognized the specific quality of a woman managing numbers that were not cooperating. The compressed voice. The closed door. The evenings when Christy was asked to stay late because Laura needed to go somewhere she did not describe and returned 2 hours later with the particular careful composure of someone who has been having a difficult conversation and has emerged from it without showing how difficult it was. Christy had been in difficult households. She knew what it looked like when someone was keeping the lights on through will rather than margin, and she knew what it required from the person doing the keeping, the daily recommitment to the ordinary things. The maintenance of normalcy as an act of protection rather than a description of reality. She had watched Laura do this for 8 months with the focused, quiet determination of a woman who had decided that Ariella was not going to absorb the weight of the financial architecture around her, and who was funding that determination through a form of daily effort that Christy recognized and respected without commenting on, because commenting on it would have required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have disturbed the convention. Ariella was the center of the house. Not in the way that makes children difficult, in the way that makes them the reason. She was 3 3/4, which she was specific about when asked her age, holding up 4 fingers and then folding one down with the focused precision of a child who has recently learned that fractions are a form of accuracy and intends to deploy them. She had the specific, full-body engagement of a child who brings her whole self to every activity, eating, sleeping, playing, noticing, asking questions that were frequently better than the answers available. She called Christy by her name, which most small children in Christy's experience did not manage immediately. She had started with Kirti, which was close enough, and had arrived at Christy by the 2nd month with the satisfaction of a child who has completed a pronunciation project. She followed Christy through the kitchen in the mornings with the specific, comfortable proximity of a child who had decided that this was her person in the mornings, not exclusively, not supplanting Laura, but in the particular way that children distribute their needs across the available adults and know, with the precision of a small organism optimizing for care, who to go to for what. She went to Christy for routine and for the particular warmth that Christy provided, not demonstrative warmth, not the performed kind, but the consistent, steady kind that comes from a person whose attention is full and whose presence is reliable. She went to Laura for the other kind, the complicated, deep, sometimes tired warmth of a mother who is carrying things above her head and still bent down to the floor of Ariella's world every evening and stayed there, fully, without the carrying showing. The photograph was on the 2nd shelf of the living room bookcase. Christy had noticed it in the first week. A man, not photographed in the posed manner of a portrait, but in the candid manner of a picture taken when the subject was engaged in something else, looking slightly to the left of the camera with the quality of focused attention that suggested the something else had been worth the attention. Dark-featured. Contained. Not smiling, but not closed, the expression of someone who had learned to keep their face as their own rather than a communication to the room. Ariella pointed at it sometimes. She said daddy the way she said words she had memorized rather than experienced, with the specific, careful quality of something learned from a source rather than from the person. Christy had not asked Laura about the photograph. Laura had not offered anything about it. It sat on the shelf in the silence that was its own explanation, the presence of something that couldn't be removed and couldn't be fully integrated. The specific and common condition of a person who is in the middle of the distance between one life and whatever comes after it. On Thursday morning, Laura had left the house at 9:15 for a meeting that she described to Christy as sorting out some paperwork. She had said it in the voice she used for things that were more than their description, kissed Ariella on the top of her head, and left without elaborating. Christy had taken Ariella to the park, managed the grocery run, and arrived at the front door at 12:47. The 4 men were already there. Christy looked at them. She looked at Ariella. She looked back at them. She made a decision that was not the decision of a woman calculating odds or measuring her own courage. It was the decision of a woman in whose professional care a 3-year-old currently resided and who had, therefore, exactly one available position. She took it. Christy Ferry stood at the front door of Sycamore Close with Ariella on her hip and told 4 debt collection men no, And then the black car arrived. Subscribe, because what Christy sees on Justin Tyler's face in the moment Ariella says the word is the detail that changes how you understand everything that comes after. Let us account for the moment precisely, because the moment is the center of the story and its center deserves precision. Ariella had been on Christy's hip for 4 hours, which was longer than the recommended duration for a 33-year-old woman's left hip, but was the duration the morning had produced. She was not heavy in the way of some 3-year-olds, she was compact, which was her mother's build, and she distributed her weight with the unconscious consideration of a child who had been carried enough to understand. In the way the body understands things before the mind does, that being an easy thing to carry was a form of cooperation. She had been watching the 4 men with the unguarded, assessing attention that 3-year-olds bring to everything that registers as unfamiliar. Not fear exactly. The assessment precedes fear in children in the specific and important way that curiosity precedes judgment. She was gathering information about the men on the doorstep the way she gathered information about everything with her whole face, without the social management that older people apply to their attention, with the direct and uninflected quality of something that was simply and completely looking. And then the car arrived. Christy felt Ariella's attention shift before she tracked it herself, felt it in the small body on her hip, the slight, full-body reorientation of a child who has spotted something that has reorganized her interest from what was in front of her to what was coming from the street. Christy turned her head. She saw the car. She saw the man who got out of the front passenger door and who she assessed in 4 seconds as falling into a category she had hoped the front door was the last of for this particular Thursday. And then she saw the man who came out of the rear door and she assessed him in a different 4 seconds entirely, the assessment of someone who recognized that the category she had applied to the 4 men on the doorstep did not apply here. That this was a different category, a category that had the first category inside it the way a larger set contains a smaller one. He was looking at the house, then at the doorstep, then at the 4 men with the brief, comprehensive sweep of a man accounting for what his arrival had found, then at Christy and the child on her hip. Ariella had gone completely still. Christy felt this too, the specific, total stillness of a child who has stopped gathering information because the information has arrived at a conclusion. Not the stillness of fear, the stillness of recognition. Ariella looked at the man. At his face, the dark features, the particular way his attention organized itself in the direction it was pointed, the quality of his eyes that Christy could not have described in technical terms, but that Ariella, who had looked at the face in the photograph on the second shelf of the bookcase every morning for 8 months, processed in the specific, immediate way of a child cross-referencing memory with reality and finding the match. And then Ariella said it. Not loudly. Not with the theatrical announcement of a child performing for a room. With the simple, direct confidence of a child naming a thing she is certain about, the way she said cat for cats and moon for the moon and daddy for the face in the photograph, the face that was now, with the specific improbability of a Thursday afternoon in February that had not asked anyone's permission to become what it was becoming, standing 12 feet from the front door of Sycamore Close and looking at her. Daddy. Christy felt the word leave Ariella's body before she fully processed what it contained. She felt it in the small chest against her shoulder, the breath that produced it, the certainty that carried it. She felt the 4 men on the doorstep go still. Not the careful, managed stillness of professionals maintaining composure, the sudden, involuntary stillness of people who have been running a calculation and have just received an input that has collapsed the calculation entirely. She looked at the man in the overcoat. This is the detail that Christy has returned to in every telling since, the detail that she says she will not forget regardless of what else she forgets about the Thursday in February. She looked at the man in the overcoat and she watched what happened to his face when Ariella said the word. It was not the face of a man managing surprise. It was not the face of a man in a professional context encountering an unexpected variable and recalculating. It was the face of a man who has been hit by something that his entire professional architecture, the overcoat, the car, the four men, the file with the address, all of it, had absolutely no defense against. Because the thing that had hit him was not a threat, and was not a complication, and was not any category that defensive architecture is designed for. It was the face of a man encountering his child. He stopped walking. He stood on the pavement. And for a moment, the specific, suspended moment between Ariella saying the word and the Thursday afternoon resuming its business, Justin Tyler looked at a 3-year-old girl on a stranger's hip, and the full weight of 14 months of distance arrived in his chest all at once. The man in the front passenger seat, Rennick, who had been with Justin for 6 years and who had learned to read Justin's silences with the precision of someone whose job depended on the reading, took one look at Justin's face and took 3 steps back from the front door, which was the correct interpretation and the fastest he had ever moved in a non-physical situation. The 4 men on the doorstep had not recovered. One of them, the broad-shouldered one at the front, was looking between Justin and Ariella with the specific, arrested expression of a man running a social equation that his experience had not equipped him for. Ariella extended one arm toward Justin. The arm of a child who has identified the person she wants and has no framework for the possibility that the person is unavailable. Justin Tyler walked to the door. He walked to the door, and he held out his hands to Ariella with the specific, careful movement of a man who understood that the child's certainty was not a thing to be deferred by adult complication. That whatever was happening with the 4 men on the doorstep, and whatever was happening with the address on the file, and whatever the Thursday afternoon had turned itself into, none of it was the concern of the 3-year-old who was looking at him with her arms out. Ariella went to him without hesitation. This is the thing that Christy has described as the part that made her hold the doorframe, not because she was afraid for Ariella, but because she was watching something happen that she had no reference point for, the specific, wordless transmission between a small child and the person she belongs to, operating entirely outside the register of language or adult management or any of the complicated things that the Thursday had assembled around them. Ariella went to Justin the way water goes to the lowest available point, with the complete, natural inevitability of something that has found its direction and does not require explanation for it. She went with both arms, and she settled against his chest, and she put her face against the collar of his overcoat, and she was still. Justin held her. Christy watched him hold her and watched his face reorganize itself around the holding, not a subtle reorganization, not the careful management of a man maintaining composure in a professional context, but the specific, fundamental reorganization of a person whose most primary thing has been returned to them after 14 months of its absence, and who is discovering, in real time, what the presence weighs compared to the absence. The 4 men on the doorstep were performing various configurations of not knowing what to do. The broad-shouldered one had stepped back from the front. The 3 behind him had the quality of men who have arrived at a situation their briefing did not include and who are waiting for someone with more information to indicate the correct response. Rennick had the correct response. He was standing at a sufficient distance from the front door, and he was watching Justin hold a child, and he was not moving, not speaking, not producing the kind of signal that would have recalled the operational context of the Thursday afternoon. He had been with Justin for 6 years, and he had never seen him hold a child, and what he was watching required the specific, intelligent stillness of a person who understands that the moment they are in is not the kind that benefits from management. Justin became aware of the doorstep. Not in the way he had been aware of it when he arrived, in the specific, different awareness of a man who is holding his daughter and looking at the men he had sent ahead and understanding, with a clarity that the drive over had not provided, what it meant that they were there. He looked at the broad-shouldered man. The broad-shouldered man, whose name was Corvin and who had been doing this work for 11 years and who had, in those 11 years, developed a reliable instinct for the specific quality of a man's attention that indicated the man was capable of things that exceeded the present situation, met Justin's eyes and looked away. Justin looked at Rennick. One look. The compressed, wordless communication of men who have worked together long enough that instruction does not require language. Rennick nodded once. He turned to Corvin. He said something in a tone that was too low to carry to the doorstep, and Corvin said something back, and the four men began the specific, organized retreat of people who have received a clear indication that their presence is no longer the correct configuration for the situation at hand. They were gone in 90 seconds. Not fled, departed. Professionally, with the contained efficiency of men who have been redirected and have accepted the redirection. The street was quiet again. Justin looked at Christy. Christy looked at Justin. Uriella was still against his chest, had her small hand curled around the lapel of his overcoat in the specific, proprietary grip of a child who has claimed something and intends to maintain the claim. "You work for Laura," Justin said. Not a question, he had assessed the groceries, the keys, the quality of Christy's authority at the front door, and arrived at the correct category. "I'm her carer," Christy said. "Household and childcare." "How long?" 8 months. He looked at Uriella, who had leaned back slightly to look at his face with the focused inspection of a child confirming what she has found. He looked back at her with the expression Christy had seen when the word landed, stripped of the professional architecture, containing nothing except what it actually contained. Is she well?" he said. With the specific, careful quality of a man asking a question he has not been able to ask anyone for 14 months. "Uriella, is she healthy?" "Is she?" "She's perfect," Christy said. Simply and accurately. Something in Justin's face released, not dramatically, not with the performance of relief, but in the way that a structure under sustained pressure releases when the pressure is finally acknowledged rather than continued. He exhaled. He held Uriella more firmly, and she, responding to the holding in the specific, full-body way of a child who understands being held at frequencies adults have lost access to, settled more completely against him. "The men who were here," Christy said. Because she was not a woman who deferred the functional questions when the functional questions were relevant. "They'll come back." "No," Justin said. "They won't." "You can guarantee that?" He looked at her with the full, unmanaged version of his attention. "Yes," he said. Christy held his gaze for a moment with the specific, unintimidated quality of a woman who had stood on the front doorstep of a house that was not hers and told 4 men no and had meant it, and who was now extending the same quality to a man who was a considerably larger version of the same category of situation. "Miss Hubbard will be back by 3, she said. "You'd better come in." Christy Ferry just invited the man who came to collect her employer's debt through the front door, while his daughter refuses to let go of his overcoat. Subscribe, because what Justin Tyler finds inside that house and what he sees on the second shelf of the bookcase in the living room is the moment the story completely changes direction. The house on Sycamore Close told Justin Tyler things that no briefing document would have told him, in the way that inhabited spaces tell you about the people who inhabit them, not through the grand statements of architecture and design, but through the accumulation of small, specific, undeniable details that compose, together, an honest picture of a life. He stood in the hallway with Uriella still attached to him. She had settled into the configuration of a child who has decided this is where she is until further notice, her legs wrapped around his waist. Her face turned to see the hallway from his height with the alert curiosity of someone for whom a change of altitude is a legitimate form of new information. The hallway was clean. Not the performative cleanliness of a house that has been prepared for visitors, the working cleanliness of a space that is managed daily by a person who understood that order was functional rather than decorative. The coats on the hooks were organized by size. The shoes below them were paired and arranged with the specific, unconscious neatness of someone who had made a habit of it. There was a basket of Ariella's things near the bottom of the stairs, small boots, a stuffed animal that had the soft, compressed look of a thing deeply loved, a hat in the shape of a bear's head that Ariella had almost certainly selected herself. Christy led him to the kitchen, because the kitchen was where she was in control, and the kitchen was where she felt the situation could be managed at the temperature it required. She put the groceries on the counter. She put the kettle on. She did not ask him if he wanted tea because the situation had produced the specific gravity that required tea regardless of preferences. And she had been in enough difficult kitchens to understand the function of something hot and ordinary in the management of something cold and not. Justin stood in the kitchen doorway with Ariella and looked at the kitchen. The evidence of the morning, Ariella's breakfast bowl, rinsed and stacked. The small stool that allowed Ariella to reach the counter, positioned near the sink. The grocery list in a child's handwriting on the front of the fridge, which was Ariella's version, which was to say a series of marks that corresponded to items Ariella had announced she required. Interpreted and written out by Christy in the dual-column format of a woman who managed the requests of small children by taking them seriously while also ensuring the actual list was functional. He was reading the fridge. Christy observed this from the counter, not intrusively, in the way she observed most things, which was the way of someone who understood that the information she was gathering was relevant to the situation she was managing. "She keeps this house well," Justin said. "She keeps it the way the budget allows," Christy said. Which was accurate, and which was also the closest she would come, in this conversation, to commenting on the financial architecture of the household. He looked at her. "I'm not here to make this worse," he said. "You arrived with 4 men and a car to a residential address in February," Christy said. "The definition of worse is relative." "I didn't know whose address it was," he said. She looked at him with the flat, patient look she produced when she had heard a sentence and was deciding whether to accept it at face value or examine it further. "But you know now." "Yes." "And the men won't come back," he said. "I meant it." She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she turned to make the tea, because the making of tea is the adult version of needing something to do with your hands in the presence of a situation that cannot be resolved by anything you do with your hands. Ariella had relaxed into the specific, drowsy warmth of a child who has resolved a tension she has been carrying without knowing she was carrying it, the tension of absence, which children carry in the way they carry everything, in the body rather than the language, in the pull toward something that is not there rather than the understanding of why it is not there. She was not asleep. She was in the state adjacent to sleep that children enter when they are in the place that feels right, the heavy, meditative warmth of being held by the correct person. Justin carried her to the living room doorway. He stood there and looked at the room, at the toys, at the books at Ariella's height on the lowest shelf, at the drawing on the coffee table that was manifestly a horse, or possibly a car, or possibly both simultaneously, at the second shelf of the bookcase. In the photograph. He looked at it for a long time. Christy, who had followed him to the kitchen doorway, watched him look at it, watched the specific, complex thing that happened in his face, the thing that was not one emotion but the specific, layered territory of many emotions that have been in the same room together for long enough to have become inseparable. The photograph was of him. He knew this. He had looked at it and known it in the first second. What he was still processing in the subsequent time was not the recognition but the context that it was there, that it had been put there, that it had been kept there for 14 months in a house that he had not known the address of, on a shelf at the height where a small child could see it, in the visual field of a 3-year-old who had learned his face from it. "She put it there in the second week," Christy said, quietly, not intruding, providing. "I don't know why she chose that shelf." Ariella noticed it immediately. Justin did not say anything. "She says his name," Christy said. "Every morning." To the photograph. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a voice that had shed every register of the man who had arrived with 4 men and a car, "Does she know what it means?" "She knows it means you," Christy said. That's what it means to her. That's enough at 3. Laura Hubbard came back at 2:47. She came back the way she came back from the meetings she described as sorting out paperwork, with the contained, careful posture of a woman who has been in a room where the conversation did not go the way she needed it to go and who has assembled herself, in the car home, into the version of herself that the house on Sycamore Close required. The version that was functioning. The version that managed the ordinary things with the warmth and consistency that Ariella needed, that set the exhaustion aside for the 6 to 7:30 stretch between Christy leaving and bedtime. That did not allow the financial architecture above Ariella's head to come down to Ariella's level. She had her key in the front door before she registered the car on the street. Then she registered it. She stood at the front door with her key in the lock and looked at the black car parked in front of the house, and she stood there for long enough to confirm what she was seeing, and then she stood there for a moment longer while the specific, cold weight of what the car's presence on Sycamore Close meant settled through her. She had known the debt was in this category. Not specifically, she had not known the specific name, had not known the document that Doyle and Pembridge had used as settlement. She had known the debt was the kind that produced this category of car in front of this category of address, and that the production of it was a matter of time rather than a question of if. She had not anticipated that the car would be his. She went inside. Christy heard the front door from the kitchen, where she had been managing the situation in the way she managed the rest of the household, with the focused, deliberate attention of someone who understood that the situation was above her pay grade and was managing it anyway because someone had to. Because Ariella was asleep upstairs, having been carried up 20 minutes ago by the man who was now in the kitchen with a cup of tea, and the specific, contained quality of someone who is waiting and knows what they are waiting for. Christy went to the hallway. She met Laura at the bottom of the stairs. She looked at her with the specific, direct look that she had learned, over 8 months, conveyed to Laura more than words when words were not the right instrument. "He's in the kitchen," Christy said. Laura's face did the thing it did when she was absorbing information that was more than its surface, the brief, almost imperceptible moment of the internal process, the specific compression of features that preceded the managed version's reassembly. "Ariella," she said. "First." "Asleep," Christy said. "She's fine." She paused. Decided on accuracy over management. She knew him immediately, Laura. The moment he stepped out of the car. Laura closed her eyes. Not dramatically, briefly, the way you close them when something arrives that you needed to arrive and were not prepared for in the moment of its arrival. Then she opened them. "How long has he been here?" 2 hours, Christy said. "I invited him in. For men came first, debt collectors. He sent them away." Laura looked at her. "He said they won't come back," Christy said. "He said it in the way that means it." Another of the brief, contained moments. Then Laura straightened. She moved toward the kitchen. Christy stayed in the hallway, because the kitchen was not a room she needed to be in for the next portion of the afternoon, and because she had managed the situation to the point where it could manage itself, and because her presence in the kitchen would have been the professional version of a thing that was no longer a professional situation. She heard Laura stop at the kitchen doorway. She did not hear what passed in the first moment between them, not words, because there were no words in the first moment. She would understand later. What she heard was the specific quality of a silence that contains more than silence, the kind produced by two people who have 14 months of accumulated, unspoken things and have just found themselves in the same kitchen for the first time in those 14 months. Then she heard Laura say, in the voice that was stripped of the careful management, the voice of the person underneath the version that the house required, "How did you find the address?" And she heard Justin say, "I didn't. Doyle and Pembridge gave it to me in a file." A pause. "You didn't know?" "No. The men are gone. They won't come back. The debt is cleared." Another pause, longer. Christy, in the hallway, held very still. "Justin." "She knew me," he said. The moment I got out of the car. She knew my face. The kitchen was very quiet. I put your photograph on the shelf, Laura said, where she could see it. I don't know why she stopped. I couldn't take it down. I know, he said. The shelf. At her height. She says your name to it, Laura said. Every morning. The kitchen remained quiet for a long time. Christy stood in the hallway and listened to the quality of the silence, the specific, particular silence of two people who have been in the distance between what they were and what they could not quite manage to stop being. Sitting together in a kitchen in February with a child asleep upstairs and 14 months between them. Justin Tyler just told Laura the debt is cleared. Laura told him she couldn't take his photograph down. Ariella is asleep upstairs after finding her father for the first time in 14 months. Subscribe, because the unpredictable twist in this story hasn't arrived yet, and when it does, it changes the shape of everything that came before it. The file. Christy found it on the kitchen table when she came in the following morning. Not accidentally left placed, with the specific deliberateness of something that has been set down intentionally for the person who would find it. It was a folder, the kind of folder that holds legal documents, and on its cover, in handwriting that she had not seen before, were 2 words, for Laura. She set it aside. It was not hers to open. She made Ariella's breakfast with the focused, ordinary rhythm of a morning that was attempting to be ordinary and was succeeding, approximately, in the way that mornings after extraordinary days succeed, with the small, quiet relief of the routine being available. Laura came downstairs at 7:30. She saw the folder on the table. She picked it up. She held it for a moment, looking at the 2 words, and then she opened it at the kitchen table while Ariella ate porridge and Christy kept her own attention appropriately directed toward the porridge. Inside the folder were 3 documents. The first was a letter of full discharge from Doyle and Pembridge's solicitors, confirming the debt obligation of Laura Hubbard was settled in its entirety. Dated the previous day. Signed and witnessed. The second was a document from a firm Christy did not recognize, not a legal firm, a financial institution confirming the establishment of a trust account in Ariella Tyler's name, with an initial deposit that Laura looked at for a long time before she turned the page. The third was a 1-page letter in Justin's handwriting. Not typed, written in the specific, deliberate manner of someone who has decided that this particular communication required the version of their attention that involves a pen and paper rather than a keyboard. Because a keyboard is the instrument of communication and a pen is the instrument of the thing underneath communication. Christy heard Laura put the letter down. Then she heard the specific, quiet sound of a woman absorbing something that was more than she had been braced for, in the particular way of things that arrive when you have been braced for less for long enough that more has become unexpected. She did not look at Laura. She looked at Ariella's porridge. What the letter said, she would not know until Laura told her sister Veronique that evening by phone, and Veronique, who was not a woman who managed information she considered important, told Christy 3 days later in the hallway of Sycamore Close with the compressed excitement of someone delivering something they believe the recipient needs to know. The letter said that Justin had been building a legitimate exit from his operational business for 2 years. That the logistics company and the warehousing facilities were in the final stages of a sale to a consortium that had been assembled with the specific, patient care of someone who understood that a clean exit from a complicated situation required a different order of patience than most people were willing to extend to their own lives. It said that he had not known her address because Gideon Vare had constructed the legal architecture of the separation to prevent him from knowing it, and that he had accepted this architecture because the dissolution had been conducted in the specific register of a conflict that had exhausted both of them, and that he had not, at the time, understood how to resolve without continuing to make it worse. It said that when he had seen Ariella that Thursday afternoon, he had understood something that 14 months of correspondence through solicitors and Gideon Vare's careful letters had not conveyed, that the distance was not a protection for Ariella. That a child who had learned his face from a photograph on a shelf was not being protected from him. She was being kept from him in a way that the shelf, with its daily daddy to a photograph, was honestly and heartbreakingly documented. It said that the debt was gone. The trust was for Ariella and was unencumbered by anything connected to his operational business, which was, by the time the letter was read, the business he was finishing rather than the business he was running. It said, "I know we ended badly. I know the badly is more mine than yours, and I am not asking you to revise that accounting. What I am asking is whether there is a version of what comes next that includes me being Ariella's father in the way that Ariella clearly already understands I am. I am not asking you to decide this today. I am asking you to consider it. And I am asking because she knew me immediately. From the photograph on the shelf. On the shelf where you put it, at the height where she could see it. It said, I don't think that was an accident." Laura read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in the folder with the other documents, and she held the folder and looked out the kitchen window at the February morning that was attempting to be ordinary, and she sat with the specific, complex weight of a woman who has spent 14 months building distance and has received, in a folder on a kitchen table, a document suggesting that the photograph on the shelf had already told the truth about the distance while she was still maintaining it. Ariella finished her porridge. She climbed down from her chair. She went to the living room. She stood in front of the bookcase. "Daddy," she said, to the photograph, as she did every morning. Laura heard it from the kitchen. She held the folder. She looked out the window. The photograph had been on the shelf for 14 months. She had known, when she put it there, that she was putting it there for Ariella. She had told herself that. She had maintained that account through the morning routines and the school runs and the managed financial architecture and the 6 months of missed repayments and the letters from Gideon Bear. The question in the folder, in Justin's handwriting, in the sentence about the shelf, was whether the account she had been maintaining was the accurate one or whether Ariella had simply been more honest about it than she had. Christy Ferry was not a woman who inserted herself into the private decisions of the people whose households she managed. She had a professional philosophy about this, not a formal one, not articulated in the language of workplace conduct, but the practical, earned philosophy of a woman who had been inside 6 households and had learned that the most important thing the inside of a household required from someone like her was the specific, careful quality of being present without being intrusive, of being a person who could be trusted with the intimate proximity of daily life precisely because she did not treat that proximity as access. She managed the following weeks in the way she had managed the 8 months before them, with the focused, consistent attention of someone doing the work the household required. She did not ask Laura about the folder. She did not tell Ariella anything about Thursday's afternoon beyond the ordinary reassurance that children require when unusual things have happened in their orbit and they need the adults around them to confirm that the ordinary is intact. Ariella, for her part, had filed the Thursday with the specific, instinctive completeness of a child who had been waiting for something without knowing she was waiting for it, and had received it, and was now going about her business from the slightly more settled ground of a child whose fundamental accounting has been corrected. She still said "Daddy" to the photograph every morning. But there was something different in the saying, less the careful, practiced quality of a learned word, more the familiar ease of a word that has found its actual reference point. Like the difference between saying moon before you've seen one and after. Justin came to Sycamore Close on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the Thursday. Not with the black car and the men and the operational architecture. He came alone, in a car that was considerably more ordinary, at 9 a.m. on a Saturday with the timing of someone who had understood, from the letter and whatever conversation had happened between the letter and the Saturday. That Saturday morning was the correct configuration. Christy was on duty. She had been asked, by Laura, to stay for the morning, an unusual request, because Saturdays were typically Christy's own, but asked in the specific, careful way that Laura asked for things she genuinely needed, which was different from the way she managed the requests that were about management. She opened the front door. Justin looked at her with the expression of a man who had categorized her correctly on Thursday and was now encountering her in the revised context of Saturday. "Christy Ferry," he said. "Justin Tyler," she said. With the specific, level quality she had produced at the front door on the Thursday, which had not changed because the Thursday had not changed what produced it. He almost smiled. It was the first time Christy had seen anything adjacent to a smile on him, and it was, she thought, a significant improvement on the alternative. She stepped back. He came in. Ariella was in the living room. She heard the front door, and she came to the living room doorway with the focused, alert attention of a child who has learned to be interested in who comes through the front door on Saturday mornings. She looked at Justin. He crouched down to her height, the deliberate, careful movement of a man who is making a spatial decision about the correct way to enter a 3-year-old's field of vision. Not dramatic. Not performed. The same quality he brought to everything, which was the quality of someone who had thought about what the moment required and had done it without making the thinking visible. "Ariella," he said. She looked at him for a moment with the assessing attention. Then she walked to him. In the specific, full-body purposeful way she moved toward everything she had decided to engage with, and she put her small hand on his face. Children do this. They verify with their hands what they have confirmed with their eyes, because the hands have a kind of knowing that the eyes haven't finished with yet. She put her hand on his face, and she looked at him from the distance of several inches, and she said, with the clear, complete certainty of a small person who has had a question open for 14 months and has now closed it. "You're here. Not Daddy. Not the photograph word. You're here." The word of presence rather than the word of identity. The word of a child who has moved from the picture to the person and has noted, with the specific, full-body satisfaction of confirmed expectation, that the person has arrived. Justin put his hand over her hand on his face. "Carefully, the way you cover something small that is offering itself." "Yes," he said. Christy stood in the hallway and watched this and felt, in the specific way of a woman who had worked in 6 households and had learned to recognize the moments that made the work what it was rather than what it was paid for, that the Thursday in February had not been what it arrived as. It had not been a debt collection. It had not been a confrontation or a resolution or any of the categories that the black car and the 4 men and the operational machinery of Justin Tyler's professional life had suggested it might be. It had been a child who had learned her father's face from a photograph on a shelf and had recognized him with the perfect, uncomplicated accuracy of 3 years and absolute certainty. The moment he stepped out of a car on Sycamore Close on a Thursday afternoon in February. The debt that had brought him there had been the file in Doyle and Pembridge's folder. The debt that mattered, the 14 months, the photograph, the morning ritual of a small voice saying a name to a face that could not answer, was the one he had spent the 3 weeks since the Thursday beginning to understand how to repay. Christy went back to the kitchen. She put the kettle on. She listened to the living room, where Ariella was explaining something to Justin in the detailed, exact language of a 3-year-old who has a great deal of information to convey and has identified an audience with sufficient patience to receive it. Laura came downstairs at 9:30 and stood in the kitchen doorway. She looked at Christy. Christy looked at her. "She's showing him her drawings," Christy said. Simply. Laura listened to the living room for a moment. The sound of Ariella's voice, the full, engaged, proprietorial voice of a child who has claimed an audience and is deploying it. The sound of a man's voice, low and attentive, asking the question that the child's narrative had paused to invite. "Okay," Laura said. Christy filled 2 cups and set them on the counter and went back to the ordinary business of a Saturday morning in a house on Sycamore Close that was managing, in its particular and improbable way, to be slightly more than it had been the week before. The photograph was still on the second shelf of the bookcase. It would stay there for another 3 months. When it came down, it was because Justin had been to Sycamore Close on 4 Saturdays and 2 weekday evenings and had, at the specific request of Ariella, who considered this a reasonable project, taken a new photograph with her in it. The new photograph went on the shelf. At the same height. In the same position. Ariella pointed at it the next morning. "Daddy and me," she said. To no one in particular. With the complete, satisfied accuracy of a child who has updated her records and finds the update correct. Christy heard it from the kitchen. She looked at the kettle. She thought about the Thursday in February and the 4 men on the doorstep and the black car and the word that had stopped everything, that had gone through the operational architecture of an entire afternoon like a key through the specific lock it was made for, with the complete and total efficiency of something that had always been designed for exactly this purpose. Daddy. 1 word. 3 years old. And every adult on a pavement in February frozen in its wake. She put the tea on. She went about her morning. It was the most ordinary, extraordinary thing she had ever been in the middle of. Which was, she had come to understand, the accurate description of the kind that lasted. The end. From a doorstep in February and 4 men who didn't know what to do with themselves, to a Saturday morning and a child updating her records on a bookcase shelf, Christy Ferry, Ariella, Justin. And Laura's story proves that the most powerful moment in any complicated situation is almost always the simplest one. A 3-year-old recognized her father's face. She said the word. 4 men went still. 1 man went somewhere he had not been in 14 months, and a photograph that had been sitting on a shelf at a child's height told the truth that 2 adults had been managing around for 14 months. The debt collectors sent Justin Tyler to Sycamore Close. Doyle and Pembridge handed him a file that Gideon Vare couldn't intercept. And Ariella did the rest with 1 word and both arms out. Hit subscribe for next week's story. A woman hired to clear out a deceased stranger's house discovers, in the 3rd room, a wall of photographs, every single one of her. The estate lawyer calls with the explanation. She has 24 hours to decide what to do with the inheritance. The decision will floor you. See you there. Real talk. When Ariella said, "You're here," instead of "Daddy" the second time, after Justin came back on the Saturday, was that the most significant line in the entire story? A. Yes, "Daddy" was the word of a photograph. "You're here" was the word of a person, and the difference between them is the whole story. B. No. The most significant line was Christy saying no to 4 men on a doorstep while holding a 3-year-old, because the whole story depended on that 30 seconds. C. The most significant line was Justin's letter asking whether the photograph on the shelf was an accident, because Laura's answer to that question is what the story was actually about. D. All 3. And I need Christy Ferry to manage my household because she is the most competent person in every room she enters. Drop your answer below. And tell us, have you ever witnessed a moment where a child's complete, uncomplicated certainty cut through something that every adult in the room had been making complicated? What happened? Also, Laura kept the photograph on the shelf at Ariella's height for 14 months. She told herself it was for Ariella. Justin's letter asked if that was the whole account. What do you think? Was it? Sound off in the comments. Because this story is about one thing underneath everything else, the things we keep when we tell ourselves we've let go, and what happens when a 3-year-old is honest about them before we are. What do you think?